Hi, in this video we're going to talk about phylum Mollusca, or in other words, mollusks. That includes animals like snails, clams, and as you see in the video, squid. So the phylum Mollusca is obviously the Latin name for what we commonly know as mollusks. Mollusks can be spelled with either a C or a K. I looked it up because I was curious. K is more traditionally found in North America, whereas C would be in the rest of the English-speaking world. As we look at their ancestry, we look at mollusks, which are right here. So as you can see, they're part of the Leucotrophozoa. That means a couple of things. That means that they're protostomes. We'll talk more about that in a second. That also means that they are bilaterally symmetrical. Then they have all of the characteristics that protostomes have. Those characteristics include things like bilateral symmetry, and triploblastic, or in other words, having all three tissue layers. As members of the clade Lophotrochozoa, that means protostome development. So protostome development, remember, means that as the gastrula forms the gut, it forms from the mouth first. Unlike the other Lophotrochozoas we talked about in class, they are true protostomes. So in other words, they have a full cavity. We'll speak about that in a second. Additionally, as members of the Leucotrophozoa, that also means that they grow without molting. They don't have that extra outer covering they have to get rid of before they can get bigger. And they are trophophores. That's not a term I've introduced real in depth yet. Trophophore is simply a reproductive stage, a larval stage, in which it has this ciliated, or in other words, this shape here with the cilia around the outside structure while they're reproducing, while they're larvae. So, Lophotrochozoa are members of bilatera, so they have bilateral symmetry, which also means that they have cephalization, they have a head. Additionally, as I mentioned, that means they're triploblastic, and they're coelomates. So as I said, they are fully protostomes. They have a full coelom, completely lined with a mesoderm. And they have a very specific body structure. Now, as you looked at the pictures on one of the first slides, we've got snails and octopus, and obviously and clams, they look very different from one another. However, they all have a couple of characteristics in common. So traditionally, they have a soft body, and most of them have a hard outer or inner shell. So the main structures they have, besides many of them having a shell, is that all of them have what we call a mantle. So a mantle is a membrane that covers their internal organs. Part of the job of the mantle is to create the shell if they have one. The area where their organs is known as the visceral mass. And finally, they have a muscular foot. And that muscular foot could serve as a couple of functions. It could, like a squid or an octopus, help them move around. It could be what goes in a snail to kind of creep along. Or, in the case of a clam, it could be what's used to attach them onto a structure. You're probably familiar with the zebra mussels or barnacles that stick on stuff. Those are both mollusks that use that muscular foot to hold on real tight. Here's a good spot to pause for notes, rewind if you need to, and also to review. As we look at the mollusk's basic body plan, we can see that those structures, the shell, the mantle cavity, and muscular foot, all are found in all of the different body plans that we have. So we have the gastropods, which, like the snail, they have a full digestive tract, so separate mouth and anus. And we've got the mantle cavity, which is the membrane that covers the organs. In this case, it's pretty much just the gills. We have their muscular foot, and of course their shell. We see those same structures in a very different form in the clam, the bivalve, and as well as in the squid. In the squid, the shell is internal. Others, of course, lack a shell. When we look at this picture and we look at the visceral mass, which is the internal structure of the mollusk, we can see that they have a much more complicated body plan and internal organs than a lot of the organisms we've studied so far. Those structures, as you look at them on the screen, should start to look a little bit familiar too. Stomach, heart, liver, those are all things that we have too. So those are adaptations and characteristics that have survived and been found in a lot of different kinds of animals. So as we look at their organ systems, the organ systems are, of course, the different kinds of organs that work together for a common function. As we look at some of their functions, we'll start with feeding. So as I mentioned, mollusks have a complete digestive tract, so a separate mouth and anus. They also have a radula. A radula scrapes food into their mouth. It almost reminds me a little bit of a tongue, though it has a different structure. In this picture, the radula would be this structure right here. It should be noted that not all mollusks have a radula. Clams that are filter feeders don't need a tongue to scrape anything. They pull the water in. And mollusks all pretty much have gills with the exception of those that are terrestrial, in other words, land animals. So if you're a land animal, a gill isn't going to do you a lot of good, so you would rely on diffusion if you're a mollusk like a snail and you need to get oxygen. Remember, diffusion is just molecules moving from where there's a lot of it to where there's less of it. So in the case of oxygen, it would go from the air where there's a lot of oxygen into the animal where there's less. Mollusks also have a circulatory system. Most of them have an open circulatory system. So if you recall from our beginning animal notes, open circulatory system means that they have a heart, so a pump, that pumps the blood flow and keeps it moving and circulating. However, it's open because it opens into where their organs are and it bathes their organs in the blood, but it's not contained in vessels. That's better than not having a heart, but it's much more effective to have a closed circulatory system. And as we go through the mollusks, what we'll find is that we're constantly making an exception for what we call the cephalopods. The cephalopods are like octopi and squid that look like they have a head attached to tentacles or arms. And they are consistently more complicated than some of their other mollusk relatives. And so what makes them more complicated is that they have a closed circulatory system. When we look at excretion, the excretory system, remember, is in charge of controlling cellular waste, getting rid of excess stuff, not like digestive waste, which would be, poop, but other stuff that our cells need to get rid of, and controlling water loss. So mollusks do that with a structure known as nephridia. We'll see these also in some of the worms that we'll look at. Nephridia has a similar function to a kidney. It's a little bit more complicated than a flame cell, and it serves for excretion. And for their response, because of course many of them are hunters and many of them have much more awareness of their environment, they have a much more advanced response than some of the organisms we've seen. So most of them have ganglia. This is ganglia here. Ganglia are centralized nerves that control their sensory organs. Most of them have eyes, and again, making an exception with the cephalopods, they actually have brains. So their ganglia are developed enough that they can have much more cognitive processing. In fact, in class, I'll show you some really cool videos of really smart cephalopods, especially the octopus. Reproduction in mollusks is only sexual. There is no asexual reproduction in mollusks. Most of them are either male or female. There's very few hermaphrodites, although a couple exist. Depending on the species, we will find both examples of internal and external fertilization. Terrestrial are often internal because internal fertilization is a great way of not having your offspring or your sperm dry out. Aquatic are often external because they don't have to worry about that drying out component. And once again, remember, we're talking about Lophotrochozoa, and these are trophivores, which means the free-swimming larvae have that cilia structure that we see here. In this picture, we can actually see the larval structures of barnacles and snails, both of which are mollusks. Here's a really good spot to pause if you need to, rewind for notes if need be, and then let's review as well. Okay, let's talk quickly about why we as human beings care about mollusks. There's several reasons. Number one, some of us eat mollusks. They're important food species not only for us but other organisms. They're also bioindicators. So bioindicators are species that are either common when water quality and environmental quality is good, or that are present when it's bad. And so by looking at that, depending upon what kind of species we're talking about, we have a good idea of whether or not our water quality is good. So filter feeders concentrate toxins, and because some of our clams are filter feeders, if our bivalves, the clams, the ones that have two shells that close like this, if they're present, then we have hopefully a good chance of having good water quality. We also have a keystone species. Some of the clams are so important to their environment that without them, the whole ecosystem collapses. In the case of clams, that helps us filter water and prevent algae blooms. And finally, they're pest species as well. Not all of them, but many of them can be very destructive to crops as well as wood supplies. And of course, you're probably familiar with some of the clams and bivalves that grow on man-made structures. such as zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are a really big problem in the Milwaukee area, as well as their cousins, quagga mussels. They flood intake valves. They get stuck on boats and get carried to other inland lakes. They hurt when you walk on them, and they filter the water so much that they actually filter it too much, removing some of the microorganisms that other organisms need to survive. So they actually filter too well. Finally, let's talk about some of the clades that exist within phylum Mollusca. As I've hopefully you've gotten so far, the phylogenetic relationships that we use to group organisms are constantly changing. So I used to teach this and say that there were 8 different classes, and we were going to talk about 3 of them. And I'm not going to do that this time. So there's different clades, and we're still figuring out which classes are which. But we're looking at really 3 subclades. The first one I've mentioned is gastropod. Gastro means stomach, pod means foot, so it literally means stomach, foot. And those are organisms who look like they're crawling around on their stomach. So that would be things like snails and slugs. We also have bivalves. Bivalves have 2 shells, the bi meaning 2. So those 2 shells would be things like clams, like oysters, like scallops, zebra mussels, quagga mussels, all of the mussels. And again, they have 2 shells. And then finally, I want to talk about cephalopods. Cephalopods are one of my favorite, especially my favorite invertebrate. Cephalo, remember, means head. So cephalopod literally means head, foot. And we're talking about the nautilus. We're talking about squid, cuttlefish, and octopus. So first off, they're incredibly smart for invertebrates. They mostly have tentacles. They're able to move almost like jet-like motion. So they take water in and shoot it out real fast, and it propels them much like a jet would propel a plane. And they're much, much more complex. So they have eyes much more like ours than invertebrate eyes. They have brains. There's been examples of octopus who figured out to get food out of a jar. They have to unscrew it. I'm going to show you some really cool videos, but they're super, super smart. All right, rewind if necessary to get notes, and let's review one more time. That's it for the mollusks. As always, make sure you get the notes and make sure you come to class with questions you may have. We're going to dissect a mollusk in class, so hopefully you enjoy that too.